Okay, so when you think about the Gospel of John, I'm going to guess the Avengers aren't the first thing that comes to mind, right? But in this breakdown of a sermon by Pastor Stephen Wilhoit, we're going to see how a famous scene from Infinity War actually helps unlock one of the most profound statements in the entire Bible.
So the sermon kicks off by throwing us right into Avengers Infinity War. It takes us to that moment where Doctor Strange is peering into the future, and he sees a staggering number of possible outcomes for their fight against Thanos, over 14 million of them.
And you know, they're facing what looks like total, certain defeat. So everything boils down to this one critical question. Out of all those millions of futures, in how many do they actually win?
The answer he gives? It's pretty shocking. Out of more than 14 million possibilities, there's only one. Just one single path to victory.
So this whole Avengers analogy, it's the perfect setup for understanding exactly where Jesus' disciples are at, emotionally. Because just like the heroes in the movie, they feel like they're facing total defeat. Their leader is about to leave, and they feel completely lost, troubled, and are just desperately looking for that one way forward.
I mean, you can see their problem pretty clearly, right? They are in a full-blown crisis. But what's so interesting is that Jesus' solution, it's not a map, it's not a 10-step plan, it's a direct command. Believe in God, believe also in me. That's the immediate first aid for their troubled hearts.
But, for the disciples, who are thinking in really practical, down-to-earth terms, just being told to believe isn't quite cutting it. So one of them, Thomas, basically says what they're all thinking. How can we possibly know the way if we don't even know where you're going?
And what Jesus says next, well, it's one of the most famous and, frankly, most radical statements in the entire Bible. With just these few words, he completely flips their entire problem on its head. The focus shifts dramatically from finding some kind of path to knowing a person, himself.
So, here's the absolute key takeaway from the sermon. The path isn't something you find on a map, it is someone you follow. The way to God the Father is the relationship with God the Son. They don't need a GPS coordinate, they need to know Him.
And it gets even better than that. The sermon points out that Jesus doesn't just, point the way and say, "See you later, good luck." He actually promises to come back and personally take them there. What that means is that this journey is never supposed to be traveled alone. And get this, arrival is guaranteed by His power, not by how well you can follow directions.
Okay, but an idea this big, this radical, it's naturally going to raise more questions, right? And that's exactly what happens. Another disciple, Philip, basically says, "Okay, prove it. Just show us the Father." And his request kind of forces Jesus to explain the mechanics of how this all works, what the sermon calls the rules of the road.
And instead of just giving him a straight answer, Jesus replies with a question of his own, and it gets right to the heart of God's very nature. See, Philip's request to see the Father separately is actually impossible, because that's just not how God works. You can't split them apart.
The pastor uses this term mutual indwelling to explain it. Basically, the Father and the Son are so completely intertwined that you can't have one without the other. To see Jesus is to see the Father who is dwelling in him. You can't go around the Son to get a different look at the Father. They are revealed together as one.
And this is the really cool part. This is where this huge kind of abstract theological idea suddenly stops being just theory and becomes incredibly practical. The sermon shows how this applies directly to the life of anyone who believes.
Because then Jesus makes this just staggering promise. He says that anyone who believes in him won't just do the same stuff you did, they'll do even greater works. I mean, how is that even possible? What on earth could that mean?
So the sermon makes a really important clarification here. When Jesus says greater, he's not talking about quality, like, "You'll do better miracles than me." He's talking about quantity and scope. Think about it. Jesus' own work on earth was limited to one person in one specific place and time. But through his Spirit, that work can be done through millions of believers all over the world, all throughout history. It's an exponential expansion.
And boom, that's the final piece of the puzzle. That whole mutual indwelling thing we talked about with the Father and the Son, now it actually extends to believers. We're incorporated into the divine life. We are in Christ, and Christ is in us. We become the vessels for God's work in the world today.
Okay, so this all sounds amazing, but how does it actually work day to day? The final part of the sermon tackles a really important question. What happens when you're on this way and you stumble? When you need help?
The answer, the sermon says, is prayer. It's described as this infinite supply of assistance. And check this out. Notice how prayer itself is built on that same Trinitarian structure we've been talking about. You pray by the Spirit's power, through the Son's authority, to the Father.
This is so crucial. The sermon points out that when Jesus tells us to ask in my name, it is not some magic password, you know? It's not like saying abracadabra to get whatever you want. It means to pray in alignment with who he is, with his character and his mission. It's about praying for the things that help get God's work done.
So in the end, this sermon takes us on this incredible journey, right alongside the disciples. We go from their fear of being totally lost to a completely radical redefinition of the entire spiritual life. It's not about finding a road, it's about knowing a person. Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought to chew on. If the path truly is a person, what does it actually mean to walk it?